Each of these medallions are made of materials that actually went to the moon and returned back. More specifically, they're made of the heat shields bolts that brought the astronauts to the moon in the historic lunar missions. Apollo 11, 12, 13, 14, 16, and 17. Instead, this is a piece of film that flown in the Apollo 11 mission that was used to make videos during the mission. That is always a piece of a bolt that hold the heat shield and flown in the Apollo 11 mission, but that is a piece of the Eagle lunar lander pulley clamp that landed on the moon. But how did we manage to land on the moon? Follow me in this documentary, where I'm going to explain the entire Apollo 11 mission in the detail. To reach the moon was needed a giant rocket that was powerful enough to send a spacecraft in its orbit. That was the Saturn V, a 3-stage rocket that assembled reached a height of 110 meters. It was built in the Vehicle Assembly Building, where arrived from all the America the pieces of the rocket. But let's take a look at the most important pieces. This is the first stage that had 5 F1 motors, and it was alimented by kerosene and liquid oxygen. The most of the mass was concentrated here. This is the second stage that has 5 J2 motors. This stage was alimented by liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, and it would have carried the Apollo 11 into low Earth orbit. And finally, the third stage that had only 1 J2 motor, alimented by liquid hydrogen and oxygen, and it would have carried the Apollo 11 in a translunar orbit. At the top of it, there was the Apollo spacecraft. The Apollo spacecraft was composed by 4 main parts: the fairings that protected the lunar lander, the service module that hosted the propulsion part and the propellant, the capsule that hosted the astronauts, and the launch escape system that in an emergency situation would have brought the crew to safety. This engineering masterpiece had a thrust power of 500,000 cars, and it was able to reach 40,000 kilometers per hour. The launch mount selection for the launch was the 39A of Cape Canaveral. Obviously, we owe this engineering opera to all the scientists, engineers, and the people who worked hard to achieve this goal. The rocket was rolled out 2 months before the liftoff, and in this period of time it was meticulously inspected and prepared to the flight. Finally, the moment arrived. The astronauts got ready and mounted in the capsule on top of the rocket. Everything was ready, so they started to fill the rocket tanks with the propellants, and the crew access tower was retracted for safety.
7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, mark.
-5 minutes. Retro SRO, okay, Cord. I'll read you loud and clear, how me over.
And finally, the last seconds of the countdown arrived to start an event that will remain in the history forever. In these final moments, it is estimated that 700 million peoples were following the launch around the world.
Spacecraft, and we're initialized for 72. GRR, Roger, GRR.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, ignition. Liftoff.
Roger, clock. Clock, flight. Well done. Roger, we got a roll program. Roger, roll. Standby for 1 Bravo. Mark, 1 Bravo. 1 Bravo.
The rocket was so heavy that to lift it from low launch pad was needed 9 seconds. The rocket, free from the arms that kept it to the pad, started its journey to the moon.
13+32+00.
Traveling at supersonic speed, the rocket resisted at extreme aerodynamics and structural stress, passing trot the period called max Q.
How you felt?
Stand by for mode 1 Charlie.
Stand by for mode 1 Charlie. Mark, mode 1 Charlie.
Staging square booster. Go. Righto. Go. Guidance go. Good for staging, Captain.
Apollo 11, this is Houston. You are go for staging.
Go. All the time continue off valley.
Inboard cutoff.
We confirm inboard cutoff.
Confirm inboard. Roger.
That's 2 Cal.
Here.
Good.
Roger, S2.
Drop down again, bottom, go back to raw.
Level sensors armed. EBW's armed. Roger.
TFS, Fido. Copy, TFS.
Station. And ignition. Cut off. Ignition.
The first stage, run out of the propellant, was separated from the rocket, igniting the second stage's motors, and separating the interstage, starting to brought the rocket in orbit.
We got cruise set.
Roger, we confirm.
Roger. Tower's going.
Roger.
The escape tower was also separated, as it was no longer necessary, making the rocket lighter.
For mode 4 capability.
Mode 4.
Mark, mode 4 capability.
After putting the rocket into low Earth orbit, the second stage was separated and made an orbit of control to verify that the situation was nominal.
Roger. Station and ignition.
After the security checks, the third stage ignited to send the rocket to its voyage to the moon. The Apollo 11 was in its trajectory to the moon, so the fairings opened and released the Columbia, that docked with the lander and brought it away from the third stage.
All the surface of it, just kind of shakes like that. It ain't just one spot, so it's not being hit. Also, there's some pressure. Just from the aft firing, you think? Stand by request.
Apollo 11. This is Houston broadcasting in the blind. Request Omni Bravo. If you read us, request Omni Bravo. Out.
Finally, the spaceship started its voyage to the moon. During their cruise to the moon, the crew continued to test and check the ship and to take care of themselves to be prepared for the great day.
Now, booster. Roger. Had a good call on that bad telemeter there. Yeah, that was looking a little bad there.
The ship started to roll on itself to limit the temperature rising caused from an excessive exposure to the sun. This is the Eagle's control panel in an inspection made by the astronauts during the third day. Finally, the Apollo spacecraft arrived on the moon, and after an extension of the main motor to slow down, it was finally in the lunar
We
orbit.
can see on the orbiter photos, doesn't seem to stand out very well here.
During the orbits around the moon, the astronauts started to admire the lunar landscape, analyzing the craters to gain scientific data, and they even filmed the activity. After the scientific activities, the astronauts started to prepare themselves to the descent on the lunar surface.
Okay, PDI pad.
The astronaut Michael Collins remained on the orbiter. Meanwhile, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin transferred to the lander and undocked from the ship to start the descent to the lunar surface. And finally, the Eagle started to deorbit to make its final descent on the surface. But during the descent, the astronauts noticed that they weren't in the designated landing zone. So they took the manual descent, but despite the remaining fuel started to leak, they managed to land successfully on the moon.
Forward, forward, drifting to the right a little. Down a half. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again.
And as Neil Armstrong touches for the first time the moon, he pronounces the famous phrase,
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
and with this, they started the activities on the surface, and for first thing, they planted the American flag on the ground.
Look at this deal, cube. Yes? Okay? That's beautiful, Mike. It really is.
This is the video taken while they were planting the flag on the surface.
Yes, indeed. They've got the flag up now, and you can see the stars and stripes on the lunar surface. Beautiful, just beautiful.
During the scientific activity, the astronauts documented everything with some photos. In that photo, you can see the Earth seen from the moon, right above the lander. Meanwhile, in these, you can see the astronauts deploying the passive seismic experiment package, a seismometer which would have detected any quake.
Got it. Tell them that we're good for an extra 15 minutes. And if they are so far away from that 10-minute mark, based on that. He asked what would we estimate for the document, and we're estimating about 1.
In that, instead you can see the experiment lunar laser ranging, which would have calculated the Earth-Moon distance more precisely.
Flight experiments.
These are the photos of a meteoritic crater on the moon, where you can see the meteorite's fragment into it.
Activity. Short period Z.
At the end of the extravehicular activities, the astronauts returned on the Eagle with a lot of samples, and letting on the moon the instruments no longer necessary. There they rested for a few hours, and after that they turned on the main engine to ascend from the moon and return into lunar orbit.
Balance couple off.
There they reunited and docked with the Columbia, and they transferred the samples on it. The Eagle was left in orbit. Meanwhile, they relit the main engine to start the cruise back to Earth.
What are we going to ask the crew if they cycle the PU valve?
During the return trip, they even made some funny live TV streaming while they were drinking floating water or watching the Earth.
No matter where you travel, it's always nice to get home.
And finally, they started the atmospheric re-entry, protected by an ablative heat shield that protected the astronauts by the plasma at extreme temperatures. Entered in the low atmosphere, the capsule opened the parachutes, splashing down in the Pacific Ocean. After the recovery, the astronauts were quarantined in a minivan and met the president. After a quarantine of a few days, they started a world tour after the successful mission.
Astronauts gather in the window.
Neil, Buzz, and Mike, I want you to know that I think I'm the luckiest man in the world. And I say this not only because I have the honor to be President of the United States, but particularly because I have the privilege of speaking for so many and welcoming you back.
From the Apollo 11 mission, where recovered 22 kilograms of samples, and after the analyses, were discovered new minerals, the almacholite, the tranquilityite, and the pyroxferroite. Some samples were also distributed on a lot of different nations on order from the President Nixon. Even some pieces of the spacecraft were distributed to the various nations in the form of medallions, in memory of the great accomplishment in this historic mission.